Our first conversation tonight is with an interesting young man who he studied. He got a PhD and in computer sciences. He went on to teach at Harvard and have an academic career. He was one of the youngest to be inducted into the Harvard Society of Fellows, only the second computer scientist ever to be inducted, after the first being Marvin Minsky, who many of you may be aware of as pretty much the father of artificial intelligence. But that has not gone on to define him or his chosen life. In fact, if there is something that defines him, it is not domains or genres. It is the arc of his passions that seem to not be complementary, but radically different from each other, yet come together in a person who shows you don't have to pick one or the other. You don't pick science or the arts. You don't pick human engagement or scholastic enterprise. You find ways to merge them all. So part of Rohan Murty's trajectory involves, of course, an artificial intelligence company that's working at the cutting edge of AI and automation, also an innovation lab that he set up in Boston, also the Murty Classical Library, which has set for itself a 100-year target of making world-class scholarly translations of some of the Indian classic literary texts, and we hope to talk a lot about that this evening. He's also working on collecting art specifically by female artists, and that's, as we said, just a few of the strands that he is pursuing at every time. That shows not a love for domain, but a love of knowledge per se. What makes a young man with a formidable education, a formidable last name, and a formidable mind choose these dramatically different interests is the starting point for this conversation tonight. It's an absolute privilege to have Rohan Murty. Rohan, the best part is that there often don't seem to be connections between many of the things that you're doing, and that's wonderful, because human journey is not meant to be linear. How did you arrive at this mix of passions?
Actually, there's
No, that's great.
good evening. No, there's no set formula. It is mostly series of fortuitous accidents, one leading to another, and perhaps no connection between any of them even. So there's nothing really extraordinary in that sense. There's no great arc of a story that connects any of these things. Maybe I'll speak about the classical library first. Just by way of introduction, since anyway, I suspect Hyderabad is probably similar to Bangalore in that I grew up in Bangalore. I have glasses, South Indian, so I do computer science. No surprise in any of these things. But when I was a graduate student in computer science, that's when perhaps for the first time in my life, I started to read and reflect and think a lot more about where, when I say I don't just mean myself, but my friends and I, my family, where we all come from, our culture. Is there something unique about it? What is different about it? And so on. And, to cut a long story short, I remember one evening I was in conversation with a friend of mine who was doing his PhD in French literature. And he was very proud. He was naming, one person after the other. And he said, oh, do you know 10 great Indian authors from the last 1,000 years? And the truth was, actually, I didn't know. Of course, I knew some contemporary Kannada writers in the last 50 years, but besides that, largely speaking, I did not know. And then he said to me, saying, look, don't you think it's very strange? You come from a country that's quite old in terms of its history, and you can't really name 10, and you can name, at the same time, you're able to name Wordsworth, and you can say Shakespeare, and, Walt Whitman, and James Joyce, and so on and so forth. And that's when I realized, maybe, there is something a little strange about my own setup. And I'm also not unique in this. Growing up in a city, went to an English medium school. The syllabus I studied was not one of these international syllabi. It was in the ICSE, so it's an Indian national syllabus. And that's when it sort of, the more I reflected, I realized, when I think back to my school education, we read Walt Whitman in 9th standard, and our teacher explained that it's the poem about "Oh Captain, my Captain."
Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, our fearful trip is done, and we didn't know what trip and who's this captain. Then they said it's Abraham Lincoln. Some of us who had heard of Abraham Lincoln outside of school had some clue, many others didn't. And it was so foreign and strange. And then we read James Joyce's Ulysses, to strive, to seek, to find, never to yield. But even there, even today I remember the poem talks of Priam's limbs being slaughtered, and we just thought, man, whoever wrote this in whichever country, these are really weird people. It doesn't make any sense to us. It was completely foreign context. And yet, we studied, we mugged, we cross-examined these texts. We studied Hamlet for 2 years and so on. So after doing all of these things, these completely foreign texts, we absorbed them, digested them, we passed our exams, we were judged based on how well we knew these texts. And none of these things contained a single Indian author. I don't know if it has changed, quite dramatically today. I suspect it has not, at least in the Indian syllabus. In fact, if you go to the international syllabus, it's even more true, obviously. And so that's when sort of I began to feel maybe there is room for doing something more interesting in this space for helping people like myself and many others.
Will you give us just a brief outline of what is the mandate that the Murty Classical Library has set for itself?
Right. So we are a multi-year, as Payal was mentioning, multi-year effort. Our goal is to translate ancient Indian texts. When I say that, immediately people say religious texts, not just religious texts. What we mean are things like literature, prose, poetry, even court documents, various things like this, from the last maybe 2,000, 2,500 years. And not just, when you say ancient, people think Sanskrit, but actually it's beyond Sanskrit too. We do Sanskrit, of course, old Kannada, or as we say in Kannada, Hale Kannada, or old Tamil, because it's classical, it's not contemporary forms. Medieval Telugu, because compared to Kannada, at least Telugu script came much later on. Medieval Bangla, medieval Marathi, Punjabi, Persian, and so on and so forth. So 14 different languages. Texts in these languages, we have gathered a group of scholars from about 18 to 20 something countries and these are people who have dedicated their lives to these languages, and they are translating these texts to English. So when you open the books, on the left-hand side, you'll see the original script. On the right-hand side, you will see the English translation. And our mission is to do this about 4 to 5 volumes a year. We release them every January, and to do this for the next 100 years. So it's at least the next 100 years.
So there's the challenges of this, of course, are first also to find scholars who know these medieval languages, but also what is the framework for a classic? Will you give us an example of 2 or 3 of the works you find particularly engaging that have been translated?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there is actually no formal definition of classic in what we do, because it really varies by language. The notion of classic, notion of Sanskrit versus old Tamil versus medieval Telugu are quite different. Of course, if you ask people in Tamil Nadu, they'll tell you Tamil came before Sanskrit. But putting that aside, so as an example, one of the first books we translated was a book called the Terigatha. By the way, if you go onto Flipkart and Amazon, you can find all these books.
We do have some of the books available here. Today we have books for all our speakers. We do have some of the books, but they are available also on Amazon and Flipkart.
Excellent. So the Terigatha is from roughly 200 BC. It's by the first Buddhist nuns. These are women who I don't think anybody becomes at least my limited impression reading the book is you don't become a nun in most circumstances out of joy. It's usually out of some extreme circumstance of heartbreak or some deeply spiritual experience that comes out of pain. And so it's poems by different women of their lives and how they became nuns. This text is important because it's, at least as far as we know, it's the earliest poetry written by women anywhere that is still accessible to mankind. I say that carefully because maybe there were texts written earlier that may not be accessible anymore. And it's written in Pali, the language in which Buddhism rose and spread. And in Pali, it didn't really have a script, so it's in Burmese script. And we've translated the entire thing end to end. And in our estimation, there are probably fewer than 100 people on this planet who can really read the original text and English at the same time. And so it's really a treasure trove. I mean, in some sense, I always joke that what we're doing is we're producing time machines. Because when you read these texts, you learn about life 2,200 years ago. And it's an extraordinary book. It's very difficult to read. It's from the perspective of the heartbreak and the pain, and the content, but it's still a remarkable book. So that's an example. That was, the first year when we launched. More recently, in 2019 January, we released. I think this in my. People often ask me what's your favorite book. It's like trying to pick your favorite children, but I think my favorite one is Risalo. If there are any Sindhis in the audience, you perhaps already know this. If you don't, you should definitely get Risalo. Even if you're non-Sindhi, by the way, you should definitely read Risalo. It's the cornerstone of Sindhi poetry, and there's stunning commentary, and also there's a wonderful introduction for every book that our translators write. I always tell people, even if you don't read the actual book, and some people are honest enough to say, I put 20 of these books on my shelf and I look very intelligent. That's great. Then read, at least for parties, read the introduction, and you will really learn something valuable about that book.
But this is also, of course, it's also just, first of all, civilizational knowledge being, as you said, taken into the future. However, while that hasn't necessarily happened in India, correct me if I'm wrong, some of this is now taught in universities in the US. Are some of the classics taught?
Yeah, very much so. And so, in fact, with my friends who are faculty at the classics department in Harvard, I would say, look, you say Greek and Latin, when you say classic, and they say, oh, all undergrads have studied classic, and usually they say Greek and Latin. I say, man, my mother tongue is also quite old. Why isn't that a classic? Kannada, old Kannada. And so the longest refrain was, okay, you produce these books and then we'll include them. So now that they're produced, actually it turns out that many of the courses, I know at least at Harvard, and I know I have faculty, and people write to me randomly, people I don't know, saying we're using it in this course, they're using it in history, they're using it in literature, in some philosophy courses as well. So yeah, many US universities have begun to use these courses as part of their curriculum. Though, while that is nice, that really was not the focus of my original intention. The focus of my original intention was that students in India don't end up, like myself and many others, where they only know Shakespeare and they don't know any Indian authors. And that as part of school curriculum and college curriculum, you would read Shakespeare and all these other things, and next to them you'd also read some of these great texts. And I think, to be honest, we're some distance away from that for it to happen in India.
There's a lot more to this conversation, but I'd like to kind of segue into, and we were speaking of this earlier, an interesting project or an experiment that you tried with your friend Manjul Bhargav about teaching mathematics in Sanskrit. And there's a history to that. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, it's not so much an experiment. So there's a new project that I'm trying to find time to get off the ground, but the idea is very clear. So a few years ago, our family friend, his name is Manjul Bhargav, and some of you may know who he is. He's the first Indian origin. If you don't, you should definitely check out his videos. I think he's a cool cat. Manjul is the first Indian origin person to win the Fields Medal, which, if you look at the Fields Medal, makes the Nobel Prize look like anybody can get it, kind of a thing. Of course, I'm being facetious. And he's an extraordinary mathematician on the ranks of Ramanujan over the last 100 years. So I listened to him speak once, about. And by the way, to be fair, Manjul is not the first person to speak about this. There are many mathematicians in India and across the globe who actually spoke about this too, of the deep connections between Sanskrit poetry and mathematics. Now, at the face of it, some of you may say, okay, this guy sounds like one of those Vedas and rocket in the Vedas kind of people. No, I'm actually talking fact and not fiction. So I'll give you a very neat example. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. Sorry, if I'm going on, you can...
No, quadratic equations, please.
No, so the example is roughly from about 1300 years ago. If you look at the occurrence of syllables in Sanskrit, there are long syllables and short syllables. I'm greatly simplifying here. And it turns out, if you look at the patterns in which these syllables can appear, and actually a poet about 1300 years ago named Hemachandra actually asked this question. He said, if I'm trying to compose a stanza, what are the different ways in which I can combine long and short syllables in Sanskrit? And he asked this question in the form of a poem. And he gave the answer and the proof for the answer also in the form of a poem as a stanza. So it was mathematics. And it turns out the answer that he came up with, about 100 or 200 years later, roughly, was rediscovered by Leonardo of Pisa, who was also called Fibonacci, and that we in our schools, in a very dry, dull method, learned as the Fibonacci series. The reason I use this as an example is that when you see Hemachandra's version and the statement of the same problem, it's in poetry form. It is far more amenable than learning that Fibonacci sequences, you take last two numbers and add them. Well, why should you do it? What does this mean for anybody? Actually, it doesn't mean anything at the face of it. But the fact that you can derive this sequence from a man-made language is really remarkable. Because at the other end of this truth is that you'll find several flowers in nature, the number of petals that appear are actually all in Fibonacci sequence. And you'll find like this too, Fibonacci appears throughout nature, that it should be natured and in a man-made language, which God knows how old, is extraordinary. And the second extraordinary facet of this is that poetry was the lingua franca for expressing mathematics. In fact, more recently there's a translated and sort of interpreted text that shows the beginnings of calculus, limits and so on, were written again in poetry form and discovered about 200 years, maybe 100 to 200 years, I don't know the precise numbers, before Newton, were done in the Madhva school in Kerala. And it's all in poetry form, which is stunning, right? That you can learn mathematics through poetry. And this is where I've seen Mandal give these extraordinary lectures. We've had, we once organized one where there were about 1,000 school children, middle school students. And usually I've only seen children get excited if some Bollywood type of person or some cricket type of person are there. But you had somebody talking of poetry and mathematics, and the children were all excited, jumping up and down. And we had teachers coming and talking to us saying, do you have a textbook on this? Can we teach mathematics through? Now, you can't teach all mathematics through poetry, but at least there are parts of it that become accessible. And that truth, I think, is one of the most interesting things that I have seen the last 10 years, or I have learned for myself, I should say, in the last 10 years, because we have never learned mathematics this way in school. I would suspect most people in this audience learned mathematics in the most dull, dry, boring way, the same way that I did. And imagine a future in a world where not just children in India, but children anywhere could learn mathematics through poetry, certainly when they're young. I think it could induce very different outcomes. It could induce certain kind of interest. So the idea of the next project is to create this compendium of poetry and then commentary around it that's all free, and that basically becomes this Wikipedia-like resource for mathematics, but all expressed through Sanskrit poetry. And that children everywhere in the world will learn mathematics through poetry. That's at least.
That's a radical upending, both of language and maths, which tend to be, mathematics is its own language. To be able to marry an ancient language and a discipline that is considered hard-nosed is really radical.
No, and it is stunning, right? Because there are so many things there that we have taken for granted. As another example there, when you transmit knowledge without writing it down, which was the case for many generations. So now let's say I'm expressing all these theorems and proofs as poems. As an example, so Aryabhatta, one of his famous examples of the first known quadratic equation, I'm greatly summarizing and simplifying, but it's the entire thing is about the journey of a bee. And if anybody has studied Sanskrit in school, you know it better than I do. And this little bee goes from one flower to another flower and it's tracing the journey of this bee. And along the way, it meets another bee. And so, it goes on and finally it ends with, so, oh, now fair maiden, now tell me how many bees were there. And it turns out the answer to this question, if you trace it through, is actually a quadratic equation, right? And this way of reasoning, this way of thinking, this way of, more importantly, this way of expressing is something that we truly, I think we've all lost. And it's a matter of attempting to rediscover it and then re-educating people.
So, and I'd like to move to your work in artificial intelligence, but one question still staying with the arts is you had started to collect, I think, but also to find, basically look for art by female artists. Will you tell us a little about that? In particular, is it from a particular era, region, but also why female artists?
No, so that hasn't really begun, Payal, to be honest. It's still in the early days of it, so there isn't much I can say that would be as interesting. But the why, at least, the reasoning is, it's it's through talking to some of my friends and so on who study art history. What I've come to learn and appreciate is, again, these are not things I usually read about or know. Is how art by women has systematically not been valued historically, but is no less extraordinary. Why should it be than any other art? And so, some of my friends and I one night we had this crazy idea. Why don't we just create the world's largest open source? We'll acquire art, and it's not expensive. It's not some tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars or this or that. It is not. I've seen in online auctions my friends saying this thing you can buy for $100 should not be 100. If it had been by a man, some of my friends have collected, who are scholars in this area, have collected statistics to show this should have been $100,000 or $200,000 piece of art. So our idea was, okay, with a low budget, we'll collect a large collection, and we'll digitize things and so on and open source it out. And maybe in 20 years there'll be scholars and the public who want to study and read how these things changed. So that is the idea, but it's still very early days.
A lot of your work seems to be, for example, you said art history and your language and the classics. What triggered your interest across these domains? Is there a particular point of interest, or where does your curiosity about these worlds come from?
I don't know where curiosity comes from, but I'll say the following. Growing up, I had an extremely limited view of my own education and also my own outlook to what is education. So in my family, in a few generations, the first person to not study science or engineering, and I say a few generations, it's true, is my sister. She's 3 years older than I am. And I remember she said she's studying economics and she was in college in the US. So I told her, you're wasting India's hard-earned foreign exchange studying basically arts and crafts. I was very foolish, I was young. But then at some point in my life, I realized that, I had such a limited understanding of, I understood computer science reasonably okay, but I never understood anything beyond it. And really the study of the humanities humanities reflect on the human condition. The study of the humanities is the way that we live or have lived or ought to live. And I knew nothing about it. And perhaps that realization was, I don't know if it was accidental or having friends who were more broad-minded than myself. And so it really perhaps came from here. And I was also in a phase of my life where I was willing to learn anything and anything that came my way. So I think that's really...
But coding, you started as young as age 4.
No, that's not true. 8. But...
Wow, that's...
no, but it was...
wasted 7 years, yes.
No, something, by the way, on my way here today, I was thinking you should rename your club from Algebra to Programming, and I'll tell you why. The reason is, why is algebra so fundamental, right? Over periods of time, education systems have evolved to understand that algebra is something really fundamental, and that is the reason for naming this, right?
Yeah.
I believe programming is even more fundamental than algebra, and it ought to be.
It's hard enough to get people to sign up to come to something called algebra. Try programming.
Okay, maybe a fancier name in the future, yeah? But now there are kids who are as young as 5 and so on who are beginning, there are easier forms of programming who are learning Scratch and various other things that friends of mine at MIT have developed. But in any case, no, in my case it was again, a series of fortuitous accidents. We had an old, computer at home. I didn't know how to operate it. My father came home one day, must have had a terrible day. This is all pre-liberalization days, so easy to have terrible days, I imagine. And he saw me sitting in front of it. I literally just didn't even know what to type. I was just staring at the green screen. And he came and just yelled, "This is the problem with you. You are all the time playing and never doing anything seriously." And he told my mother saying, "Please get him to learn something serious." So my mother put me into a programming course when I was 8. There used to be, before AppTech, there was another company called Brilliance Tutorials. I don't know if it was pan-India, it was certainly in Bangalore.
Yeah, they still are, I think.
Yeah, and the course ended up having many people from Infosys themselves who are learning C programming who are 25 and plus, and then there's me, and I understood nothing.
And you were 8.
Yeah, and my mom's not a tiger mom. I think she just wanted me to do something, and she just thought, okay, we'll just throw him into this thing and we'll see. And nothing clicked. But after about, but I still kept going because my mom said, no, we paid a lot of money, you just show up. So after about 2 months, for many kids, I think, in my school, and I think for all of us when you're young, you always want to know if you can do something that's different. Some people played cricket very well, and some people are good debaters, some people are handsome or whatever. They're quite proud of it. In my case, I thought, oh, I don't have anything. But then, somehow, after 2 months of this not learning anything, some bit flipped and something clicked. Suddenly, everything made sense. And I don't know what it was. And then I felt like I found a canvas on which I could paint. And, this was not some kiddie programming. This was serious programming. I felt I found a way of expressing myself that I had never had in my life before. And that was deeply emotional. I find code, and I'm not alone in this, by the way. There are many people who are passionate about it. The way people feel about art, programming, and code can be no different. Music, programming, art, mathematics can be no different. And when that bit flipped, I realized I found something in my life that my friends had cricket or whatever else, I had this. And since then, this is the only true passion I would say I really have.
And when you did study computer science, and for a while you were an academic, but what again flipped the switch towards entrepreneurship? Because I think Sirocco is the company you set up.
We're in stealth, so I don't really mention too much for the company. But no,
Pretend you never heard this.
No, I love being in academia. My mother's side of the family, we're several generations. I think between 4 to 7, depending on how one counts it, of generations of teachers. My father's side of the family, I think for 3 generations. My father's the first non-teacher in his side of the family. So, and my hero is my uncle. My uncle is the head of the astrophysics department at Caltech. He's also the world record, I believe, for the most number of papers written in Nature by a person. So I grew up idolizing these kinds of things. So I always thought I would, when I was young, if you asked me what you will do when you grow up, I'd say very clearly at age 8, I'm going to get a PhD and be a professor. And I still think it is cool. I still think it is cool. And it was a fun life. It's just that there was a series again of fortuitous accidents, much like my interest in the humanities. I kept an open mind and I landed up in one place to another. And I found myself doing things outside of academia. So there was no great notion that doing entrepreneurship is cooler or better than being a professor. I don't think so. It's just different.
So when you say artificial intelligence and automation, will you give us a sense? I think you said, and that was an interesting way to put it, that you told your father, if you have 100 people to do one thing, we hope to do it with one.
No, that's just to rib the old man. But
I'm sure it worked.
Or I should say my old man, sorry. No. Actually, no. Let me actually give you, instead of, I hesitate to use the word artificial intelligence because everybody here must have heard, it's so used and overused and abused that those words don't mean anything anymore. Let me instead just give you the higher level sense. If you think of manufacturing, the last, let's say, 120 years, manufacturing has really developed a science of how to, you have a complex object like a car. You break a car down into many smaller objects. How do you produce these smaller objects? How do you put them together? Starting from Ford to Deming to various other folks have figured, the science of how do you produce these things out. And I would say it's a well-studied, fairly understood, fairly mature discipline. That's how from iPhones to everything we make them today, right? So this is one part of the world. But now, in some sense, called blue-collar work. But now come to office work. I'm not a fan for these labels, but I'm translating it in a way that all of us understand it. Office work or white-collar work largely relies on machines or software. No matter what your job is in any company, if you don't have software systems, you don't get your job done today. But the flip side of that is that, unlike in manufacturing where you actually had a plant where you would physically put things down and say, this is how work happens, it's very hard to deviate from it. In office work, for example, you go to a company, let's say an insurance company, and you ask, there are 100 people, doing some work with insurance claims. It turns out if you study it carefully enough and interview people and talk to people, 100 people are doing it 100 different ways. But the manager at the top will tell you there's only one way of doing it. And they think that's how it's being done. But on the ground, there are 100 different ways. Because there are many more degrees of freedom. It's not as well structured. So in other words, there's no real science of understanding how office work gets done or how white collar work gets done. It doesn't matter from a CEO all the way down to somebody, let's say, from a mid office to a back office. And so what some of my friends of mine in graduate school and I have done, in fact, there's a Harvard Business Review article about our work coming out, and what we're calling it basically is we believe that we have figured out for the first time ever, using ideas and techniques from computer science in machine learning and so on, the science of how work gets done or the science of office work. So we basically invented technology that observes, how man and machine interact, and by mere observation, it reverse engineers and decodes the structure of your work. So it's literally like, I don't want to say it like this because it sounds too grand, and that's not my style, but I'm just trying to simplify it. It's almost like saying you've invented technology that can do mind reading, but it's not mind reading. Just by observing what people do.
So what's the intent with that?
Once you do this, that's a good question. Jokingly, I would say the intent is you should never pay McKinsey money again. You'll have machines actually tell you what McKinsey will tell you.
I thought it's the same thing.
But the intent is that once you have software that can help you understand how work gets done today in the office, you now have a basis. You have data for improving it. You have a basis for saying, why is 100 people doing work 100 different ways? What is the most optimal way that you should be doing it? And how do you actually implement it and so on? So, you now have a reasoned way of improving how work gets done. So this is what we do.
A lot of the conversation around this often tends to segue into conversation around the future of work itself. And also whether as an automatic function of more efficiency, job losses come about. And I know that that's a difficult question because it's hard to predict. But in your sense, is the task really to maximize human potential? And if so, what do you think happens to human potential when more efficiency comes in?
Yeah, actually, who knows what the future will hold? I will not prognosticate and say, this good will happen or that bad will happen. In fact, when I read all these guys say these things, whether it's someone saying in favor of it or against it, I'm like, man, I don't know how these guys are so confident they can see the future, which I don't believe people can. But I draw inspiration from some historical trends and hope that you can extrapolate something for the future, though that even that doesn't always hold. Right? As an example, if you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution itself, the history of the Industrial Revolution is the history of increasing productivity. And when Jacquard's loom and so on, all these things were invented back in time, the people were very upset. They'd go destroy these automated looms because they thought, work was being taken away. And yet, mankind moved forward. You figured out other things and so on. So I always hope, and if I have to bet, I will always hope and bet that in the long term, I bet on the part of the human mind to be able to figure things out, to be able to find more room for creativity and thinking and judgment-oriented work. Now, having said that, in the shorter term, things are more difficult. Forget all of this talk of automation in the software sense. Very realistically, Amazon will replace mom and pop stores, or has. And not because they're bad or anything. That's just the trend of technology. And that's where, there are all these, Andrew Yang in the US, Andrew Yang, I guess, who's, the Democratic hopeful. He's saying, you should have a freedom dividend. And I know people in Sweden have talked about all these things. But I don't know even if that is the answer, because the freedom dividend is what, $12,000 a year, which is actually not much. So I don't know. I really have no sort of detailed thought on how you actually fix this.
But tech and human behavior, I know you don't like labels. I will still, for purposes of asking this question, say, are you more a tech optimist or a tech pessimist, in the sense of, does tech fundamentally change human behavior? And in your experience, is that change typically for the better?
I mean, there's no doubt it changes human behavior, right? I can't imagine. I asked my parents, how did you guys get around without GPS and maps? Uh, Actually, I'm 36. I should know. I mean, I grew up without it. So it does. Now, whether it is for the better or not, actually, I don't have a view on that either. Because what is better or not? Because people sometimes judge and say, oh, people connect through social media as opposed to meeting people face to face. Is that better or worse? Actually, I don't know. Because certainly by norms of 200 years ago to now, I'm sure people from 200 years ago to now will think we live worse off in many ways. So I think, by and large, the trajectory of technology it enables more. Now, what we do with it is left to us. So I don't have a view on whether it is.
And precisely because of its entirely pervasive nature, does technology also have the capacity to become, let me frame this provocatively, a bit like a caste system, the haves and have-nots, those who have access to the better quality of technology, not just say in medicine and healthcare, but access as a...
Now I think that is a point there's no debate. That's a point worth considering, right? And that is why, for example, I think there have to be a few more fundamental rights. As an example, I think connectivity ought to become a fundamental right. Because if all your services, everything will be more enabled through technology, then if somebody doesn't have access to these things, then
we have the highest internet blackouts in the world in this country as of the present moment.
Oh, I see what you mean.
No, so I'm saying connectivity, I'm with you, is a fundamental human right.
No, it is. As an example, right? If everything will be digital, if everything is online, everything is, whatever else, then it ought to be a fundamental right. So from that perspective, maybe there is opportunity to re-examine new norms of fundamental rights, or additions to fundamental rights, and maybe connectivity ought to be one of them. As an example, so my brother-in-law is an MP in England, from a rural constituency, from Yorkshire rural, and so he's British Punjabi. So he was campaigning on broadband connectivity, and I would say, man, I didn't know you could campaign based on this. So that's so exciting because my PhD is in networking. I'm like, I'd connect it to my work, and he would say, no, look, it's the same point that you made, which is, he's like, otherwise people in my constituency are left off the map.
In its own way, it's the same kind of breach that English as a language left many people behind.
Sure, or not having roads, or not having train connectivity, not having planes. It's like that. In fact, in some regards, it's probably even worse, right? Because if you want to get supplies, you want to make appointments to whatever else, and so on. So there is room for that, and I think as technology becomes more pervasive, some of these things are worth considering.
Wonderful. I think we're pretty much.
May I end with a plea?
Absolutely.
I always have a plea.
Please.
So for everybody here, and the reason I agreed to come to these events and speak is actually to do with how we began this conversation. Forget all the technology things. I think there are plenty of people doing the tech things. My plea to everybody here is that, this classical library project that I talked about, it's a non-profit. So, the reason I say that, it's a disclaimer. I or any of my colleagues who are involved in it, we don't make any money off of this. But I really request and urge everybody here to please go check it out. It's the Murty Classical Library of India, murtylibrary.com, MURTY. And we need everybody's help. And we're not doing this for some academic or geeky reason. We're doing it because these are all classical forms of these languages that, in my opinion, I don't want to sound dramatic and say dying, but are increasingly going to meet that fate. I take my own mother tongue as an example. My generation onwards, we actually have very few to no scholars, people who willingly, as a first choice, will go study these languages and these texts. And there are millions of texts written over generations, which will soon become a weird foreign language to us. And that's just, I'm saying as Kannada as an example. It's true for all the 14 languages. And it's really the choice of preserving and celebrating these texts is left to us. You don't have to, Romina Thappar's quote, in India is one civilization, or one place, I should say, where you don't have to invent history. You don't have to believe in all these rockets and Vedas. Instead, you have to just go read the history that's already there, and you'll see how rich it is. And that's why all these texts are really important. These are written 2,200 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And so what we all as Indians hopefully will do is see these texts, buy these texts, read these texts, celebrate these texts. If you're going to give people gifts for Diwali, for heaven's sake, you should give these books as texts, and not just these. There'll be other efforts like this too, but I do believe that I'm sorry, it'll sound like I want to end on a slightly negative note, but there's a very dire situation that we're all in the middle of. See, when there's a tsunami and you're in the crest of the wave, you do not, simple relativity, right? Or I should say relative motion, not relativity, that's speed of light. You do not realize the speed of the wave because you're in the crest of the wave. Versus if you're on the beach, you see the wave coming at you and you know that you're going to meet a certain death. I believe that we in India are in the crest of a wave which is going to be a tsunami of cultural loss. And this to me should be the most alarming thing, apart from all the day-to-day problems that we, of course, in India have, because we have so few scholars that are coming up in all of these languages that in the next 50 years, I worry that all of this information knowledge we have gathered over thousands of years will become foreign language to us, will become Greek and Latin to us. And the more time that we spend fighting and saying this language, that language, and so on, and the only people who lose is us, and the world will move on. And so if there's any hope, it is with us Indians rediscovering our own sort of heritage and culture, celebrating these texts, much as we celebrate Shakespeare and everything else. And so please do go check out what we do. These books are available. They cost less than a cup of coffee in this hotel.
They're
I
superbly
verified.
priced, which is also an accomplishment.
Because I went and I checked the menu today deliberately to make sure I can make that claim. And even our effort is not enough. We do 5 volumes a year, and even for that, we struggle to find scholars, by the way, in India and across the globe.
Rohan, I'd like to actually intervene to say many of you who were here when we had Professor G.N. Devi, and I don't know if you're familiar with him, the linguistic scholar. His argument is not the romantic preservation of language. It is that you lose entire knowledge systems every time a single language is lost. And India has the single largest number of living languages, not what the census claimed as 108. He did the People's Linguistic Survey of India, 3,000 volunteers.
That's right.
They found 750 or 60 living languages, some spoken by no more than 2 or 3 people left. But those are entire knowledge systems, ecological systems, historical systems. So the preservation of the language is the preservation of our existence. You lose...
And it's this, right? So as an example, sorry, I know I'm going over my time. I hope Mr. Gopalakrishnan will not mind. As an example, see, the motto for at Harvard is Veritas, right? Which is Latin for truth. Actually, it's just a 360-year-old university. What is the connection between this random university in America and Latin? Actually, none. But the common sort of the way human beings think is any kind of connection to something that feels old legitimizes us and also gives us a sense of continuity. And in India, given we're a young, modern nation, it turns out our historical sort of heritage is far deeper than most other contemporary civilizations, except, say, the Chinese and so on. And that is why this is so important. And one way is the text. It's not the only way. There's music, there's food, and so on. And I just want to tell you, even despite our best efforts, and we have a huge corpus, and we have scholars in all these countries, in 100 years, we would have only done roughly 500 volumes in 14 languages. That is actually nothing. That's not even a rounding off error. Because in each one of these languages, you have millions of texts. So if you say 500 divided by 14 into, even let's say take 1 million, 500 by 14 million, we are basically at 0. Right? And so if we can't even celebrate the few texts we're producing here, and so we need hundreds of these kinds of efforts, then I think people, when tomorrow your grandchildren say, oh, where are we from? You'll say, we're from high-tech city. That's it. Right? And our culture was, in high-tech city, we watched Telugu movies or something, and then that was it. But no, it's actually far deeper. I mean, just to take Telugu as an example. So please help us and help yourselves in the process, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan.